You'll be shocked to learn that in Ancient Rus, girls were given in marriage at the age of 12. And if a girl remained unmarried at 16, her parents were fined. In this video, you will discover how people lived in Ancient Rus many centuries ago, what customs they had and why they married at such a young age. Enjoy watching. Before the establishment of a unified state, the territory of Ancient Rus was inhabited by various tribal unions. These included both Slavic tribes and Finno-Ugric ones. The most significant among them were the Polyanians, Slovenes, Ilmen Slavs, Kriviches and Dregoviches. Eventually, these tribal unions formed the core of a new united state. However, not all of them were eager to unite and accept new rules. For instance, the Drevlyans often rebelled against the princes of unified Rus. The Vyatiches in particular were the last to become part of Kievan Rus. Why did they resist? It was because they had to adopt new customs, live by different rules, and renounce their own religion. Many of these tribes continued to adhere to paganism. Life in tribal communities was regulated by a specific set of rules, which varied slightly from one community to another and existed in almost all tribes. Researchers refer to these rules as the Law of the Rus. They existed before the emergence of the Rus Justice of Yaroslav the Wise, a collection of legal norms in Kievan Rus. The first records in it date back to 1016. However, the most significant turning point in the already formed Kievan Rus was its conversion to Christianity. In 988, Prince Vladimir decided to completely overcome the fragmentation within the state by adopting a single religion. Prior to this, paganism, including ancestor worship, multiple taboos and magical beliefs in spirits and gods were prevalent in Rus. Vladimir proposed adopting Christianity. He converted himself and compelled the peasants to do the same. It's worth noting that many of them were reluctant to embrace this new religion and continued to protest. The process took several years, but it was this step that allowed the previously scattered tribes to unite. Nevertheless, some aspects of our ancestors' spiritual life have persisted to this day. Maslenitsa, New Year celebrations, fistfights, sledding down hills, all of these have pagan roots. It's fascinating to observe how ancient traditions and new aspects of life introduced on Kievan Rus coexisted. Historians refer to this phenomenon as dvoyeveria or double faith. After the unification of various tribes into one unified state, the way of life for ordinary peasants did not change significantly. Apart from the new faith and a unified law, not much else was different. Of course, feudalism eventually replaced the free life, but until then, the people of Rus were self-reliant. Now you will learn about the houses in which peasants lived. When building izbas, traditional Russian log houses, local residents always took into account the weather conditions. This was also the case in Rus, where winters were extremely cold. To protect themselves from the cold, they constructed houses to be as warm and sturdy as possible. Most izbas had a corridor and 2 rooms. One of these rooms was very spacious and contained a stone stove made of baked clay. This stove served not only to heat the room but also for cooking. Most of the time the peasant family spent in this room. The second room was unheated and therefore quite cold in winter. During this season, it was used mainly for food storage. A house consisting of multiple rooms was called a hram, plural hramy. Typically, only well-off families lived in such houses. Common peasants' izbas had no windows, while the wealthy had windows made from animals' bladders. The sole purpose of such windows was to let in light. Naturally, there was no electricity in those times. Rooms were illuminated in different ways. Wealthy people could afford clay pots with animal fat, which burned well. In the case of poor peasants, they used drashnik, long dry pieces of wood. Furniture was entirely made of wood. In wealthier homes, it was decorated with beautiful carvings, and the table was covered with a lace tablecloth. Near the house, there was always a shed for animals. Additionally, a bathhouse, an essential part of a peasant's life in Rus, was found. We will talk more about this later. It might seem that 1,000 years ago, people should have looked like dirty cavemen. However, the image of a Russian person, even in comparison to more advanced Europe, was on the contrary an example of personal hygiene and cleanliness. True, the bathing customs in Rus seemed somewhat wild to visitors. Almost every day, peasants visited a banya, bathhouse, which they heated to very high temperatures. There they would beat each other with fresh birch or other tree branches, and afterward they would pour ice-cold water over themselves. This ritual was how the average village person of Ancient Rus refreshed themselves. Naturally, this lifestyle maintained the personal hygiene of everyone. Due to this, many diseases that ravaged prosperous Europe were avoided by Kievan Rus. In addition to this, every peasant led a reasonably healthy lifestyle. They only consumed healthy food, including vegetables and meat. Water at the time was not contaminated. Russian people rose with the sun and went to sleep after sunset. They spent all their free time outdoors engaging in physical labor. This, combined with maintaining personal hygiene, yielded excellent results. Foreigners always noted the strengths of the Russian people. Speaking of food, what did the common people of Kievan Rus actually eat? They had a quite good variety of food. The foundation of their diet consisted of bread and meat. Meat was obtained from both domestic animals like cattle, pork, geese and ducks, and from wild animals. Russian people often hunted, so you could find game like rabbit and even bear meat on their tables. Some of the northern peoples even raised reindeer. In addition to meat, they consumed fish and caviar. During that time, there was an abundance of fish in the waters, and there was no need to worry about catching it. They used various methods, including nets for catching fish. Eggs and milk were also common domestic products, and during the summer, peasants grew vegetables to eat. However, preserving food was the most challenging aspect. While there was an abundance of homegrown food in the summer, during the winter, people had to make do with what they had preserved. Thus, porridge made from grains, mainly barley and oats, was the most popular food in Rus. Additionally, agricultural products were used to create beverages. Russian people loved their hoppy kvass made from rye bread. Peasants also made mead, which required honey. Bees that produced this honey were kept in hollows of forest trees, which people often felled themselves. Besides honey, beeswax was obtained from them. Later, thanks to trade with foreigners like the Greeks, peasants got accustomed to drinking various wines. The attire of the Russian people was relatively simple. Men's summer clothing was made entirely of linen, a linen shirt, pants, and simple shoes. Women wore linen shirts and woolen skirts. Instead of skirts, they often wore sleeveless dresses, serving as a kind of apron. For nobles during summer, they wore kaftans with close-fitting sleeves. The fabric was made of silk with golden patterns. Over the kaftan, they wore a mantle fastened with a buckle, and their footwear was made of goat leather. Noble women wore lightweight dresses with loose sleeves, which they cinched with a white belt. They always wore a large scarf on their heads. In winter, common people wore the same linen clothing with wool added as an extra layer. In particularly harsh winters, they wore fur coats. Wealthier peasants wore silk instead of linen, while nobles and nobility added sable or beaver fur coats on top of their silk attire. Materials for clothing were obtained through hunting and gathering. Surprisingly, linen clothing was made from flax harvested in open fields, making it the most affordable option. Fur clothing was acquired through hunting but was rarely worn by peasants. More often, animal skins were sold to the wealthier people or traded with foreigners for wine and oil. It's worth noting how children were raised. Since peasants lived in large families, raising a child was a collective effort, with the older generations playing a significant role. Fathers in particular held a high position in the family, and their word was law, not to be questioned. A child who misbehaved might receive a good spanking. Among the nobility, it was common to send children to be raised in chosen noble households. There, they were expected to be instilled with martial qualities and intellectual development, preparing them for a life of noble service. This method of raising children was called kормilstvo, or fostering. In this case, a spiritual and moral mentor was chosen to be a child's guide and instructor in their parents' home. Boys were raised to be future providers for the family and warriors. They had to be physically strong to protect their families. Girls, on the other hand, were prepared for future motherhood and had to learn how to manage household affairs. It's interesting to note how girls were married off. The legal age for girls to marry was 13, according to Byzantine law, though this rule was not always followed. The nobility often disregarded it due to social and economic interests. There was even a custom where, by prior agreement and mutual consent, a girl was taken by her future spouse at the riverbank while she was fetching water. However, this practice was abandoned due to invasions by nomadic peoples. From then on, girls remained under strict supervision at home, and marriages were often arranged by parents before a girl even reached 11 years of age. Marrying girls off at such a young age was a way for large families to survive. This custom was very harsh, as not many in those times survived their first childbirth. Unmarried girls over 16 were considered old maids. Notably, the Christian Church imposed fines on parents who failed to marry off their daughters before the age of 16, as it was seen as their duty. Despite being a relatively strong state, Kievan Rus was destined to vanish. Although it technically existed until the establishment of the Russian Empire, it reached its peak during the rule of Yaroslav the Wise. However, after his death, power struggles emerged, leading to a fragmented country. Upon his death, Yaroslav the Wise divided Russian lands among his 5 sons. Soon after, 2 of the younger sons died, leaving all the lands to the 3 eldest sons. Disputes arose among them over who should rule all the lands and lead Kievan Rus. After the death of one of these sons, his inheritance passed to his children, and attempts were made to remove them from power but failed due to the assistance of the Polovtsians, a nomadic people. Consequently, Kievan Rus was completely divided into several principalities. Although attempts were made to reunite them, they were unsuccessful, and the period of fragmentation and eternal strife began. In the 12th century, Kievan Rus was divided into principalities, each engaging in internal wars to claim leadership. Despite speaking the same language, adhering to the same customs and sharing the same religion, they frequently fought against each other. They also often fell victim to neighboring states' conquests. Kiev, the capital, continued to exist during this period of fragmentation, but other cities rapidly developed into regional centers. The most significant of these were Nizhny Novgorod, Vladimir Suzdal, Smolensk, Chernihiv, and Tver principalities. Nizhny Novgorod was considered the most developed principality, with its own currency, laws, army, and governance system. It was governed by well-known figures like Alexander Nevsky, who won the Battle of the Neva against the Swedes in 1240 and the battle on the ice against the Teutonic Knights on Lake Peipus in 1242, a battle popularly known as the Battle on the Ice. Around the same time, the Mongol Empire formed, known as the Golden Horde. This period was pivotal in Rus development. The newly emerged state was so powerful that it easily conquered Rus. As a result, Russian princes were required to pay tribute to the Horde every year, significantly hindering the country's development. For almost 200 years, the country remained under the influence of the Golden Horde, falling far behind its European neighbors. In the late 13th century, the Moscow Principality began to rise. It played a crucial role in uniting the Russian lands. Moscow's geographical advantage in the heart of Russian territories allowed its princes to annex other principalities. The Golden Horde was also used in Moscow's struggles against its neighbors, helping Moscow's princes eliminate their rivals. Towards the end of the 14th century, in 1380, the first significant defeat of the Golden Horde occurred. In the Battle of Kulikovo, Moscow's Prince Dmitry Donskoy defeated the Tatar army, marking the beginning of Rus' liberation from invaders. The consequences of the Golden Horde's raids on Russian lands were the destruction of cities, a decline in culture, a halt in economic development, architecture, and a general stagnation of all aspects of society. This led to a significant lag behind Europe and other advanced states. Thanks to the victory over the Golden Horde, culture in the country began to flourish, but the economy remained unstable. The issue lay in the inequality within society. The wealthy became richer and turned into merchants, while the poor became even poorer. All land was concentrated in the hands of the wealthy, who leased it to the poor for a fee. This was how the serfdom of peasants began. They were not allowed to have their own property or switch from one owner to another. The only time they could do this was once a year on Yuriv Day. In 1533, Ivan IV, known as Ivan the Terrible, ascended the throne. At the time, he was just 3 years old and he couldn't rule independently. In those years, a power struggle among the nobles continued until 1547, when Ivan the Terrible was officially crowned. From that point, he became the full-fledged ruler of Rus. Ivan IV is remembered for his reforms. He established the first Russian parliament, the Zemsky Sobor, and created a semi-regular army. Ivan the Terrible managed to conquer long-standing enemies of Rus, such as the Khanates of Kazan, Astrakhan, and Siberia. Russia expanded significantly along the Volga River, making it a multi-ethnic country. He earned the epithet the Terrible due to his frequent repressions against dissenters, which resulted in the death of many people. After Ivan the Terrible's death, the country went through another turbulent period. One ruler was replaced by another, with frequent crop failures, famine, and uprisings. Despite all the hardships and difficulties, the Russian state continued to develop and triumph over its enemies. The life of the common people did not change significantly over this long period. Peasants in villages continued to engage in subsistence farming. Their clothing and diet remained almost the same as they were 300 years prior. Customs, child rearing, and marriage practices also remained largely unchanged. There were some small urban centers starting to appear, but peasants weren't in a hurry to move there. This was due to serfdom, which severely hindered progress.